In my head, you have held me in your arms. In my head, I've been witness to your charms 1,000 times. You have sung me a love song in my head.
Hello, and you are very welcome to episode 13 of the Attic Sessions. And we have a special poetry focus today because we're going to be first airing this programme on All Ireland Poetry Day, which is the 27th of July. So we're delighted to be joined by two very eminent poets in Ireland, Jean O'Brien and Mary O'Donnell. Welcome to the Attic.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming along. And we're really excited to talk to you because between you, I counted probably wrongly that between you, you've published about 20 books between poetry collections, stories, novels, and you've won many of the leading awards both in Ireland and internationally, so you know what you're talking about in terms of the writer's life, and that's what we wanted to talk to you about, really, this sense of, you know, from your perspective, sustaining the writer's life, what that's meant to you, how you've done it, and what you've learned along the way, I suppose, is really the focus. So if I could start with Jean, and ask how you started. What was the thing that got you writing?
Got me going. I just want to add that I think of the 20 books between us, Mary is responsible for at least 50.
Well,
15.
that's
not me, I can
may or
assure
may not
you.
be. But anyway.
Yes. My mother wrote. My mother, I suppose people are bored listening to this, anyone who does know my work, but my mother was mentally ill and killed herself when I was in my teens. And as you know, teens are very seminal times. And she wrote, and I spent a long time afterwards trying to decipher her writing. It wasn't very good, which I now see it was very much of its time, but I still was looking for a window into her in some way. And it planted that idea in me that you could put your thoughts. She had diaries as well, which I, for some reason, I was the keeper of the photos and the diaries and the wedding ring and all the rest of it. So I think that's where the idea was planted. And I used to write little bits and pieces and send them off to Bunty magazine, published one of my letters, Bunty comic, not magazine.
I got Bunty.
I was a Bunty fan. A Bunty fan, that kind of thing. And I started with prose, though. I started doing a little bit of freelance journalism and short stories. I didn't get to the poetry until later, and it was a case, I was very disappointed. I thought I was going to be Tolstoy doing the short stories, but far from it. And very kindly, Ireland Own, who's a great publisher, one of the largest publisher in Ireland, used to publish my stories, which I very boldly put under my mother's name.
And paid very well.
And they paid very well at the time.
Absolutely.
So I was absolutely delighted. But my heart wasn't in it.
Yeah.
It wasn't what I wanted to do. I realised that. And then I turned to the poetry and originally joined a workshop that Dermot Bulger had started, and a chap from Finglas called John Grundy, who used to be on the scene in the Grapevine Arts and all that. And I went to my first workshop and ran home in terror and didn't go back for a year because they all seemed to know something that I didn't know. So I went home, but I kept writing away at home.
And were they welcoming to?
They were very welcoming. It was all in my head, this stuff, all in my head.
So what age were you then?
I was well old enough. No, I was in my late 20s. I had been doing the bit of journalism and the bit of freelance and this and that, so it was in my late 20s. I came at the poetry late, but had always written of some type or another, you know.
And Mary, does that resonate with you? Would you have had a similar experience? Or?
Well, I think I probably had a different entree to it in a way, because I began to write when I was very young, and one of the greatest gifts I think my mother ever gave me was to exclaim at my first poem. And, you know, and her immediate suggestion was, let's send this off to Paul Hamlin in London. This was the children's publisher, who published at that time Octopus Books. Now we're talking about a 4-lined rhyme. And so I sent it off And lo and behold, I got a personal reply from Paul Hamlin saying that, well, dear Mary, we loved your poem. Unfortunately, we don't have a niche for it at the moment, but please do keep on and feel free to send us anything else you might write.
Great
And, it was just so encouraging,
Yeah.
to a child.
Yeah.
And after that, I just, wrote in a stop-start way. And I came from a very bookish family, but we didn't have any literary connections. So writing and art were very much approved of, but nobody really knew how to go about, doing much else about it beyond writing. And
you were a St. Louis girl, weren't you? Because I think. Did
yes,
you go
that's
to St.
right,
Louis
in Monaghan.
Because
Yes,
I'm a Louis
from
girl
Monaghan. Yes.
Were you a Louis girl?
For a short while, yes.
The three Louis girls in,
I was a
in,
Louis
in,
girl
in the
too,
attic. What are the
yes,
chances
yes.
of that? But did you find that the school was encouraging that kind of writing?
Not really. I mean, of course, it depended what teacher you had, and the formative teacher that I was to have didn't come until I was 17 and 18 in the Leaving Cert cycle. But, mostly I just wrote myself during the holidays, or if I couldn't sleep, or I think there's some part of me was always given to reflection. I was also very drawn by nature and maybe very influenced by the Romantic poets. And so I'd write when I was feeling inspired and just put it away.
Yeah.
And that's how it, and the odd thing was published in the local paper, which my parents exclaimed at. I was very lucky.
Yeah,
Yes,
that's wonderful.
yes, having that sort of sense of encouragement and not having to kind of fight for self-expression because it was encouraged.
Yeah.
So what was the point then that you began to think of yourself as a writer?
It didn't happen for quite a long time. I think after I got married and Ireland was in another recession. This was 1977, or it was heading into another recession, and there wasn't much going on. And I got to know another writer called Claire O'Connor, who's familiar to some people because she lived in Maynooth as well. And we began to have one-to-one workshops, and it was very simple things like picking a word from a dictionary. I would take my typewriter to her house, the old Olivetti, and we'd go off into separate rooms and compose a poem.
Very good.
Spend an hour or half an hour, come back to one another and talk about what we had written. And she got her poems published first in David Marcus's New Irish Writing in the Irish Press in 1981. And I, encouraged by that, I got my first poem published there in 1982. And that's when I began to think of myself as a writer, when I saw my name in print in what was a serious literary page that everybody read.
So Jean, you were saying that your first writings were published under your mother's name.
Under my mother's name,
So
yes.
at what point did you start sending out under your
When I
own?
started writing the poetry, once it was the poetry. I think because my heart was in the poetry. The other, I was sort of writing it to get published, really, to be honest. Can I just sort of backtrack slightly there and just add, when Mary was saying that, since she was very young, of course, the first book that my mother had and I read avidly was Palgreave's Golden Treasury, and spent, many years reading it endlessly. So.
I mean, I think those anthologies are a really important influence.
Brilliant,
because it's either like the soundings which we had in school and where you couldn't find many women voices, and certainly not women that were still alive. Or those,
certainly didn't find them in Palgreaves back in those days, but I still loved them, loved the rhythms and the rhymes and the...
Absolutely. So did you try David Marcus?
I was never published by David Marcus. I was never published by him.
Okay. So what was the big
what was the big breakthrough? Was probably when the workshop I was in eventually sort of turned into Dublin Writers' Workshop, of which you're familiar with, Nessa. You're familiar with it too, I think.
I wasn't in it, but
which
I knew
came
about
out
it.
of one that Martin Roper had originally set up, coming out of the one I mentioned previously, coming out of the one up in the Parnell.
That started, was it in the Oak in
yes.
Dame Street?
It started in Martin's house, in his flat at the time, and then it went around to a few houses, and then it went to the Oak. I think it was going about 4 or 5 years before it got into the Oak.
Okay.
We used to meet in a pub up in Parnell Square as well, and So that was when I started taking it seriously, because we were all taking it seriously and we were all pushing to get published.
And so many of the people in
and
that group
all
did,
of them,
didn't they?
absolutely.
I think all of anyone
Yeah.
who stayed at it and stuck at it over the years, I think every one of them published in one form or another, because it was short story and poetry.
Yeah.
And
And very long lasting, because, you know,
Absolutely.
I joined in 94.
I know,
and
in
I
different,
went up
yes.
until about 2002, 2003. So
I know, in different guises it kept going and kept going. Yeah, no, it was
Absolutely.
great. I do remember one time they sent the radio down to us to interview us, because we did take every prize in Ireland. We took, I don't mean me personally,
Yeah,
I mean
but
the
members of
workshop.
the
Yes,
workshop.
if you think about it, we had taken a number of Hennessy's, if you remember Sheila and Ted and
Yeah.
various, a number of
Yeah.
Hennessy's, many
Kavanagh.
Patrick Kavanaghs, the Goethe one, you know, everything.
Strokestown.
Strokestown. We won, we just would always, one of our members, and at the time we had a thing where when you were accepting your prize, you'd say, my name is whatever and I'm a member of the Dublin Writers' Workshop. So they sent RTE down to us once or twice to know what magic alchemy was happening down there.
Excellent.
And it did seem like an alchemy, you know. It
That
was
sounds like the
wonderful.
Dublin Writers' Workshop was very good at organising. We were having a conversation earlier, which
Yes,
we won't
yes,
reprise
but
about organisation.
I mean, we
but
used to bring our own books out. I used to sell them in Grafton Street. I used to go around to the bookshops and put them into the bookshops, which would take them, because they were all private little bookshops, take them on sale and return. Do you remember Acorn 1 and 2 and 3 and this carry on? But my first big publication, because I know at the time when I started, which was kind of way back, our big thing was to be published in Poetry Ireland.
Yes.
You were not a poet proper until... So I had published in many small journals,
Yeah.
but Thomas McCarthy put the first one, and I think they called it a women's issue.
That was
because
1984.
It had
Do
three
you
men
remember
in
that?
it.
I do, yes.
Are you in that, Mary,
I'm in
as
that
well?
as well. There
It
were
had
4 men and the rest of us were women.
And for some reason then
39
they
women.
called it a women's issue. But at the time, when there would be 39 men and 4 women, nobody ever called them men's issues,
Okay.
which I was kind of amused at. So it was Thomas Carthy. Now, not who published my first poem, but published me first in Poetry
so
Ireland.
that breakthrough
So
kind of moment
that,
of
as far as I
of
was concerned,
acceptance.
that was it.
Yeah. So Mary, did you know, you were describing yourself and Claire having these sort of
sounded wonderful.
private sort of workshopping sessions. Did you ever join a larger group, or was that part of your
I was with,
evolution?
for about 2 years, I was with I think they call themselves the Dublin Women's Writers Group that met in the Irish Writers Centre.
Okay.
And I was in that from 91 to 93, I think. I gave up after I had my child in 93. I just found even coming one Saturday a month, I found it was a commitment I couldn't make at that time. And after a few months I gave up. But that was the only one. But I found that for me it didn't always work, because I know that I was only bringing my very best work in there.
Yeah, yeah.
And also, I mean, it really depends who's in groups and how far what the level, you know, you need to find the right balance between pleasant, useful rivalry and but also, you know, and nothing else. And you know, there were some people in the group who had never been published and had never published anything, and I wasn't. At that time, I didn't really rely on all the judgment that might have come my way.
Yeah.
And
'Cause that
it
is
was
quite an
easier for me.
important-
It was easier for me to leave. I felt that was, and I just couldn't keep up.
Yeah.
And
Because
so-
learning how to sift the good kind of critique from the bad
Yeah.
critique is a
Absolutely,
really important skill for writers and groups. I think to
and I think you really do need to bring in work that is imperfect.
Yes, that
If you're
needs
really
working on.
intellectually honest, you need to bring
Yeah.
in. And I think everybody was bringing in pretty good work.
Yeah.
Okay, so they were seeing it as
That was
performance.
that's
There
just
is a
my
lot of
impression.
that,
That is
I
just my
suppose.
impression,
Yeah.
and I could be completely wrong about that. But that was the impression that I formed. And so mostly, and then I attended Sheila O'Hagan's workshop come salon intermittently for a few years, and that was that was a different kettle of fish, because you went in there and you usually came out alive, but you got honest responses and helpful, constructive responses. And I found it was just a very sparkling salon. It was the last of the salons, I think.
Yeah.
You know, and that was always great when you go to it.
Yeah.
And I found that terrific. It wasn't stuffy,
Yeah.
you know.
So
I'm probably saying all the wrong things here.
no,
and that
no.
you see, but that had come out of Dublin Writers Workshop,
see.
which Ted and Sheila were both in,
Ah, right,
and
okay.
half the
Yeah.
people. Kind of what I feel happened at the end of Dublin Writers Workshop, because it was completely open to the public. The sort of lunatics started taking over the asylum. That's a terrible thing to say, and because so it was totally unfiltered.
Yeah.
And when
Yeah.
there was too many people who had no experience of writing and too unfiltered,
Yeah.
the people who were very serious about it didn't feel they were getting heard or the type of critiquing they were
yeah.
looking for. So Sheila's one, which I know at the time people accused it a bit of elitism, but you had to have at least a book published.
Yeah.
And it was just so that you could take the level of criticism you were going to give,
I
as
think
well as give
that's
good
I think that's
criticism.
entirely
Yeah.
fair. You know,
Yeah.
like to be honest,
Yeah.
you know, I think any workshop that any of us set up, and as you know, I'm running one in a sense at the moment. You do want to be people who will work well together and provide useful criticism, but who aren't afraid to be
Yeah.
frank as well, and
Yeah.
in that sense.
Yeah, because it strikes me that, like, you know, there's quite a leap between the writing and, you know, the odd poem and going into a workshop, and then that next stage where you do have a publication,
Yeah.
and even the sort of the place to discuss what would be in a book as opposed to just this individual poem work or just
Yes,
those
yeah,
elements
yeah.
of craft. Like, did that salon provide the kind of the bridge for both of you in terms of, you know, moving from the workshop to the sort of the professional life of the writer? Or were there other elements in
Well, there was a thing, Dublin City Council, which I think they still run, attached to Trinity, where they have the writer in residence gives free workshops, 6-week workshops, and you have to be accepted on it. You have to send in a certain amount of work. And I was lucky enough to get on 3 of them, actually. I had Paula Meehan, Evan Boland, and a fiction writer, I'm not going to be able to think of his name, George O'Brien. I'm sure the same name as my own. And I found once I went to them and under Ivan's tutelage started to take my writing life seriously, or give it more space and more thing than I was giving it. I'd always taken it fairly seriously, but not pushed it or not felt. Sort of didn't feel I had a place at the table. And she very kindly and humorously explained how a lot of women thought that, and her famous thing that we all know about, they'll think if I'm writing, they don't wash the windows. And you know, did say this, and I took that to heart. I said, yes, I have to start taking this seriously, or no one will take me seriously.
Yeah. So because that was another thing that I wondered about asking both of you, that the sense of at what point you gave yourself permission to take yourself seriously as a writer, as opposed to this is a dabble.
I think I have probably since I was in my mid-30s, I have taken myself seriously as a writer, but I've had to learn to do it. I'll tell you, you know, the poetry I took deadly serious always, because I felt it was, for me, it was my universe. It was the place where I felt liberated to be and do and say and utter and experiment more than I ever could in my conventional day-to-day living. And so that is really why I love poetry. But when it came to writing my first novel, I'd been tinkering around with it, you know, and it was only when my husband said to me, Martin said, look, you planning on living forever or something? You know, you really do have a novel in you and you should get it out there. And something just slipped into place for me, that idea of the sense of mortality. And okay, I wanted to write a novel, and what was the point in being afraid of not being able to finish it? It was really, even though I still was, but that was a very helpful thing to me. And I still use that thing, you know, the sense of our mortality and the energies that we're given, and hoping that I will use them well and can continue to be productive. It's very important to me. But you know, I think women who I had published I published 2 books before my first novel came out. My first collection of short stories, Reading the Sunflowers in September, in 1990. First collection of short stories, Strong Pagans, 1991, and then the novel in 92, which was reprinted in 93 and was an Irish bestseller. It took an awful lot for me to feel I wasn't going to be found out someday as a fake of some kind, to use that unfortunate word, or, well, you know, to actually believe, this is what I do. But I have also found that throughout my life, right up to this day, I still have social encounters with people who really suspect a woman writing, that it's sort of maybe a hobby, or you know, or when you say you write, they say, well, your own books, or your own, or I'm giving a reading. Whose poetry are you reading? You know. So having to encounter that at my age now, I'm quite good at knocking it on its head now, but it's absolutely astounding, and I don't believe that older men who have published, what have I published, 13 or 14 books between fiction and poetry, would ever encounter that.
No, I don't think they would.
And it is.
And is it both
it
men
is insulting,
both
but
men
it's also
and women
ignorant.
who you're meeting who are?
It certainly right-wing middle-class women are full of it.
Okay.
And I have met a lot of those in my time. You know, and I'm sorry to say that, but it's true. The more right-wing people are, the more you encounter this attitude. And it is patronising and condescending, of course. But they can't help it either.
But they probably haven't read widely, and
you know,
or wouldn't know.
No, and so you're dealing with people who just actually probably don't know how to read. And when I say that, I don't mean to sound elitist. To read well is actually something that we those of us who read have learned from an early age. And take it seriously. It's not just a couple of 100 pages of easy reading that will tranquilise you.
Do you get those sort of odd questions?
Well, unlike Mary,
Please
as I don't
yes.
know, I don't. I mean, yes, in the sense of, I don't write novels and short story now like Mary does, and Mary came off the blocks running in a lot of ways with that. But I find when you're in company, you really don't want to say I'm a poet, because you think half of Ireland is saying I'm a poet, And if you say, well, I write, and then they say,
then they think you're a hobbyist.
Yeah, what do you write?
Would I have heard of you?
And
which is what I always find difficult.
I
you
say
wouldn't.
poetry, and then they say, oh, it's a lovely day, isn't it? And they go elsewhere. That's what I found. It's a great way of clearing the room. And the other one is sort of, yes, are you a published poet?
Yes.
Are you? And again, like that, would I have heard of you? And I always say no, but I would say to them, how many poets have you heard of? Irish poets. And they really stumble. Heaney, Kennelly in his day, but they've forgotten him. Yeats, Paul Durcan. And that's about it, So I just say to them, well, I know 400 or 500, a lot of whom are making their living at this and widely published, and we leave it at that.
To be honest, it's terrible that I've had to be honest now, to protect myself from the irritation that it sometimes causes me. I have started in the last 6 months, if I sense I'm in the kind of company that's going to say, have I read your work? I'm going to say, I am saying I'm a retired physiotherapist.
Okay, so you're just not going to bring it into
I just don't want to get into it. If I know I'm not going to be dealing with people again, I can't be bothered.
Why not say you're a retired psychologist? That'd get them on the run then.
The only time I ever dodged that was when I worked in the insurance industry, and I knew never tell a taxi driver you work for the insurance industry.
Oh, right, okay.
That is,
okay.
That's a recipe for disaster. Jean, you just recently published a new and selected.
I did.
Called Fish on a Bicycle.
Fish on a Bicycle.
In the process of putting that together, do you think you learned things about your poetry that you'd forgotten? Or was it surprising?
New and selected, obviously I trawled through some of the earlier books, and I think sometimes I found I preferred some of it than the later work, which I'm not sure you're meant to find that or say that.
It's funny you
Yeah.
do say that, because I do think sometimes there's something self-conscious
Maybe
and
the
joyous
first
about
impulse,
the early
yes,
stuff.
the early
I would
impulse.
agree.
Although I'm not sure
It's often very pure work.
joyous. A lot of it, as I say, was about my poor mother's mental illness. So I'm not sure joyous is
Yeah.
the word, but as you say, the first impulse and
Yeah.
the thing. But now, like Mary said there, I was also genuinely very interested in nature, and grew up along the Dodder River and spent an awful lot of my time. I was quite, being from a family of 6, I was a very solitary child. I think I was an odd child, actually.
Where
probably.
were you in the family? Were you
I was middle.
Okay.
Youngest for 7 years though, so I say I always, and then when my mother died, I assumed eldest. So
Yeah.
I've done the 3 roles, but I
Okay.
think I was fairly spoiled middle for a while.
Yeah.
In any spoiling that would have been there to be had.
Yeah.
You know, she spent an awful lot of time up in St. Pat's, etc. But I was very solitary and would go down to the Dodder alone. I mean, can you imagine a child, especially a little girl, being allowed to do that now, and did all the heeny things of the jam jars and the pinkeens and bringing them home and feeding them baby rice for some reason, and all that
Yeah.
stuff. So, and I had read Gerald Durrell as a child and
well.
absolutely
Me
loved
too.
it. Yes, well, I
Yeah.
think I married my husband because he and I had both read and loved Gerald Durrell. I think it was one of the things.
Well,
that
it's a good reason, because you're still married to him.
we are
so-
still
so-
married. I think it was Gerald Durrell.
Isn't it wonderful to
Isn't
have
it?
had that,
Oh,
that
it was
privilege of
magic.
having time by yourself, though?
Yeah,
Even if
absolutely.
sometimes you were
Absolutely.
unhappy, perhaps.
Yeah, no, I think once I was
or
in my
I think
daughter, I was perfectly
when-
happy.
when I look back to my childhood in Monaghan, you know, I grew up in a beautiful place with
Yeah.
beautiful
Yes.
drumlin
Yeah.
fields
Yeah.
around us, and
Yes.
a stream and stridleys, and we were in the
Yeah,
country,
yeah.
so I know what it is to do that month by month exploring
Yes,
that children
yes,
do, where you're
yes,
rambling.
absolutely,
It's a
yeah.
fabulous, it's a
And
privilege to have done
literally
it.
making your own entertainment,
Yeah.
you know. I don't know, as I say, you couldn't even dream of doing that now.
Well, it seems to be that the sort of the solitary child, the observer, the reader, you know, then that was the
The
recipe
route they
for,
took,
for,
yeah,
for being
yeah.
right. I suppose I worry now, and I was feeling very guilty when you were saying earlier, Mary, about knowing how to read, that I think I have forgotten how to read simply because social media has hijacked my reading impulses.
We have
So
allowed social media to hijack our
we have
reading.
allowed,
We
yes. I have to take
allowed.
responsibility for my addiction, it is
It
true.
definitely
too.
disrupts concentration and
it
your
does.
retentiveness. I
Yeah.
do think it does, because I suffer from that, and
Yeah.
I actually have to, you know, I close down everything every so often, and I just make myself read the books that I've been planning on
Yes.
reading.
Yeah.
Those
Yeah.
And once I
piles
get
that are-
into them,
Yeah, that you're
I discover, yes,
why
it's
wasn't I
still
in
there.
these
you know.
all along? Yeah.
No, it is. I mean, I think it is you know,
We will be
writers,
the last generation that has that
Yeah.
type of retentiveness and
Yeah.
concentration.
which is terrifying.
I do think.
Yeah.
Well, unless some other method is found, you know, but for
Yeah.
the moment,
Yes,
that's what it looks
definite.
like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mary, you translate.
A bit,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, I've translated more from the German
Yeah.
than anything else, because that used to be the language I spoke fairly fluently. But I'm out of touch with it at the moment. But I have translated about 40 of the Austrian poet Ingeborg Bachmann's poems
Yeah.
into English, some of which have been published.
And how did that sort of feed into your creative impulse, if you like? I mean, why were you interested in another voice in another language?
Well, you know, I think partly it came about when my daughter was quite small, and I found I didn't know what to write about in a way. I was a bit overwhelmed by just being a parent, and I wasn't sure if I would still be able to be a writer. You know, this ridiculous, it is a bit ridiculous, I think, looking, you know, this fear that people have that big life events will blot it all away, and of course it doesn't. It just enriches it. But I turned to translation. First of all, I loved Bachmann's poetry, and I responded very much to it, and it was a means of probably being in touch with poetry, just and maybe usefully, and I think that's all. And then I've done other bits from Dutch, which I of course I don't speak, so I was depending on versions, but it's not unlike German, so I was able to do that as well. And small bits of French to English. That was in a translation workshop that I took part in Paris in 1994, I think. So,
but you haven't translated prose yet, have you?
No, and I don't really intend to. You know, I have enough to do. I don't really. No, I've no desire to do that.
Yeah.
What is it about translation? I think I've enjoyed the exchange. I enjoy the exchange, but because I'm that kind of person. I think I'm, you know, the sort of, even in the world of writing, I'm the friendly sort that wants to keep the circle going. Actually, I do like that. It's just my nature. And so I was very involved. I edited or co-edited an anthology of Galician women's poetry in 2010. It was published by Salmon. My co-editor was Professor Manuela Palacios in the University of Santiago de Compostela in Galicia, northwestern Spain. And so we got, she selected 10 Galician women, and I selected 10 Irish writers
to translate,
male and female, to translate. I wasn't as fixed on having it all women, actually. And the idea was that each poet would translate 5 poems from the Galician, 4 of them into English and 1 of them into Irish. So I was selecting carefully. I needed people who could also do the Irish. And it all went very well. Only 1 of them reneged on me, and I had to get my husband to do the Irish translation of one of them, of one poem, because the person was not forthcoming at all. But
and it wasn't reciprocal. Did the Galicians translate?
You see, the Galicians have often paid great attention to us, and that was what prompted the idea originally. I just had this thunderbolt idea. I thought, gosh, they had published a great deal of Irish poetry in translation, and I thought, why aren't we? They're looking to Ireland. They're reading all kinds of things into our mythology and our culture. They see a connection, and I felt it's time for us to send the sound, echo back to them. Yes, we're here. We're hearing you, and that's why we did it. And I have to say, it was one of the most worthwhile projects I've ever done. Though it was difficult in a lot of ways, but it was really worthwhile, because Galicia is hearing Ireland and listening to Ireland. It really is. I found that quite moving, actually.
I think we Irish have an assumption that we are of interest in a lot of other places around the world, and we are, but we don't have that generous instinct to repay the compliment and bring stuff back in, because, you know, I don't think Irish people translate, Irish writers translate to the extent that they do in Britain, for example, or elsewhere. I don't think.
I think you're right there.
You know, there are notable exceptions. And you've been Theo Dorgan.
That's right. He used to have a series of what is it called, the Poetry Network or something. I was involved in one of those. But that tended to be translation by committee, or you know, there was a group. It was a very difficult thing to undertake. But the thing with Galicia, the book was called "To the Winds Our Sails," and it received very good and respectful reviews. I think, you know, from what I could see. And but I think, you know, in a world where poetry is so shrunken down and not that many people buy it, I think it's even more imperative that those of us, if we have any languages or any facility like that, it's good to be interested in what the others are doing, and to bring it into our own place, broaden the focus.
Broaden the conversation as well. In terms of highs and lows, I was wondering this as well about, I suppose it's what keeps you going through the tough times that writers always have. You know, how you sustain that basic impulse to keep putting the mark on the page.
You go first, Jean.
I go first.
I have to think about it.
I do remember long ago, and it was Paula Meehan who actually gave me the name of Dennis Gregg you know, up in the north of
Yes.
Ireland, where they did that
Lapwing, is it?
the
Wonderful
Lapwing
guy.
series, yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely fabulous. And it was Paula encouraged me to try Dennis, and he said he'd publish a chapbook for me. And that kind of was that first, oh, you know, someone is interested in doing this. And it made me pay more attention to what I was doing, if you know what I mean. This idea, oh, I'll get something published. But
Yeah.
then when it actually comes to the nitty gritty, and Sheila O'Hagan always used to say, you're only as good as your last bad poem, or something to that effect, which terrified me.
Yeah.
So to me, anyway, that would have been one of the first, made me want to keep going and keep. And then I was actually, we were launching it in Court in Galway, and Jessie Lendini from Salmon actually approached me and asked me, had I a manuscript, of which I nearly fell over, you know,
Yeah.
this idea, have I a manuscript? Had
Yeah.
I hell, you know?
Yeah.
And I got a manuscript, and Pat Boran, I know I'm mentioning everyone here, but Pat Boran very kindly went over it and over it with me. And looking back, he should have sent me home to write it all over again. He did so much work with me. And I always remember he said, you haven't read this properly. I have. And I kind of, don't be ridiculous, I wrote it. But he was right. I had written it, but I hadn't read it properly or with an eye to publication.
But also I think that thing of seeing things together in book form, you're not really thinking about what
Yeah.
the subtext is, what the hidden story is in the association of all of those poems together. 'Cause
Yes.
I remember I had, my first book was edited by a guy called Chris O'Rourke, who brought out Incognito.
Oh
the
yes, I
magazine,
remember that,
and
yes,
remember
yeah.
that.
I think he only published about three
Yeah,
books
I
in
remember
his
that.
short publishing career. But his background was drama, and so he was very used to kind of the idea of collaboration and production.
All right.
So he sat down, I remember it was downstairs here in the house, with all of the pages of poems sort of out on the floor, and he was saying, you're telling the story so far, and then you have a gap. We need to fill that gap. What poem have you not yet written that,
All
you know,
right, oh.
and I could not see that
What he was
with
talking
my
about,
sort of, you
yeah.
know, closeness to the woods
Yes,
rather than the
yeah.
trees. But he, and actually nobody has actually read my collections that closely since.
Yes.
Yeah, it was such an enriching
Wow, yeah.
experience to have that kind of engagement with another creative head, I suppose. So it does, but you know, is there something about needing outside affirmation to keep you going?
Or to make us see what's in front of us.
Yeah.
I mean, you'd
I
be a
think
much
there is,
more
really.
thematic
I think there
poet than
is.
I am, Mary, wouldn't you? I'm more magpie in my collections.
No, I'm quite magpied, I have to say. But I am myself. I don't, and I don't. I
But
think
you've
there is. I think there's
yeah.
pressure on poets to write a thematic book. You know, with maybe
Yes,
one or
yeah,
two overriding themes. But I don't think about that when I'm writing. But like, you know, you're talking there about Jessie, and I have to say there's a few people who have been key to me feeling I can go on.
Yeah.
Maybe I do have something to say. Jessie also approached me and said, "Have you got a book?"
No,
you know,
no.
when I had been let down by on others whom I won't name, and so she has always been an excellent presence, and I hope to publish with her again. I think the idea is that my next book may be with her, in fact,
wonderful.
because you know, and but I also found, by and large, I had very good experiences with men who helped me. Philip McDermott, the
Yes.
former owner of Poolbeg Press, had an attitude to publishing and getting books out and marketing. He had a whole vision that I'd never before encountered when it came to my first novel.
Yeah.
And that was one of the most exciting periods of my literary life, I would say, when I was a young first-time novelist. And he did good things. My book was published on the back of the success of Patricia Scanlon's City Girl.
Yeah,
Okay.
all right.
They had money to publish a
Okay,
literary
okay,
title.
oh,
It was
wow.
in some ways, we have been very lucky in Ireland to have publishers
Yes.
that you can have a personal
Yeah.
encounter with.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
I also found the same thing with New Island Books that I published with subsequently, and who you know, also ARC in England
Yeah.
that published my last two books of poems, and I have met definitely some good people who encouraged me and
Yeah.
gave me a leg up in
Here-
little ways.
Here's a question now, and it might be a slightly tough one, but
Yeah.
did you find, because I was published by a British publisher for one of my books and found it quite difficult to get readings in Ireland because I had a British publisher? Because
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right.
That's why I'm returning to Salmon. My last 2 books were published by the splendid Ark
Yeah.
up in Todmorden in the north of England. I loved their books. I loved being part of the Ark enterprise, but I found so little take up in Ireland that I
Yeah.
wondered if I had disappeared through the
Yeah.
cracks completely.
Yeah.
And I wonder why this is. Why
Yes,
should a book
why
that's
should
written
it?
by an
Yeah,
Irish poet but
absolutely.
published elsewhere
Mhm.
not also be welcomed and kept part of the
Absolutely.
party,
Yeah.
you know?
Because it's hardly an official policy of Poetry Ireland
No,
is
no,
to
it
No.
sort of
certainly
only
isn't.
promote
No,
Irish
no,
published
so-
work.
So when it came to getting those books reviewed, took a very, very long time.
yeah,
And
yeah.
readings, forget it. But on the other hand, then I also think, well, you know, I'm probably an older poet now, and older established poets are also part of the furniture.
Mm.
And unless they are
Yes.
winning major prizes,
Yes.
they're not of much interest.
Yes.
Mm.
And it's the same for
Yes, I
fiction
agree.
writers.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
Yeah.
nobody's going to. You're not hot when it comes to
Yeah.
you know a lineup
Yeah.
for any festival
And
or
is
anything.
that always the way? Has it always been the way that it's what's new and young as opposed to?
I think so myself a little
Unless
Yeah.
you are Seamus Heaney or Paul Muldoon or the very, very top,
Yeah.
then it's what's new and exciting and the squeezed middle, you know.
Okay.
bit. And it is. I think it is
Yeah.
natural to
Yeah.
constantly seek
Yeah.
out the avant-garde. Though
Yeah.
I don't know that we have an avant-garde in Ireland even still, but the new, the young, that's
Yeah.
understandable. I know that I had some wonderful times as a younger writer, and I'm sure it was because I was young and still up and coming, and you got offered things, or if you applied for them, you had some chance of getting them.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
it's a different thing now, and I suppose it's in some ways it's of less interest to me. The main thing for me is that I still write.
Yeah.
I will write till the day I drop. I
Yeah.
hope.
Yeah, because that was, I suppose, my follow on. That if what gets you into writing is some sense of the excitement of self expression, of crafting, of making work, but with a sort of an assumption that there will be an audience, how you sustain yourself through the period we are now in, our sort of middle years, if you like, where perhaps the audiences aren't there. Do you need the audience to continue to write, or what sustains you?
I do. I'm writing. It's not. I know we all write for ourselves in a way. That's it's a different matter. It's a philosophical, ongoing conversation.
Yeah.
But I do need to know that if I
Somebody
send work out,
is
it's being
hearing.
published in
Yeah.
this or that magazine.
Yeah,
And interestingly, that keeps me going now as I
Yeah.
work towards whichever the next book is. I'm not sure whether
Yeah.
it's poetry or fiction.
yeah,
And the fact that the work is still being accepted out there is good.
Yeah.
I'm happy. It means you're in the dialogue again,
yeah, yeah,
or in some way.
yeah. And Jean, what's your take on that?
I would agree with a lot of what Mary said. Mary just says it a lot better than I'd articulate it. I think, for me anyway, I go through different periods. And about 2 years ago, I don't know why, I just nearly gave it all up. I sort of felt I wasn't making any inroads.
I
and
didn't
that,
know that.
yeah, I got very, what's the point? And other than the point being that, as you say, at some level you write for yourself, your
Yeah.
own ideas. But I found I wasn't getting published when I was sending it out by people who had previously always published me. And I didn't know what had
Me too.
changed. Yeah, and I couldn't understand. I kept looking at my work to see, was it radically different, or was what they were publishing radically different, or I don't know. But then maybe all writers feel that. Maybe everyone feels there's some clique out there that they're not part
Yeah.
of, and that other people will be saying, what's she on about?
Yeah.
And I was talking to Patrick Cotter about that, and he said to me, down in Cork,
Oh, indeed.
Munster Literature
Yeah.
Centre, and Patrick said to me, something to the effect of, sure, you've arrived, Jean. That's some battle in your own head that you've been fighting for years. He said, you don't need to be fighting that one anymore.
Yeah.
You know, and that's all well and good, but I didn't see them rolling in to invite me to all the festivals when my New and Selected came out, which, you know, now very kindly Murray Connell, the Leaves Festival, you know, I'm going to be with her this year.
Yeah.
But that was about it,
Yeah.
you know, and you sort of feel,
Patrick's words are still very
Yes.
wise, though, I think.
yes, in a way,
You know,
yes,
because,
and yes.
But you wouldn't want to be complacent, though, Mary.
No,
I mean,
No.
no, absolutely not.
You know, I think
No.
it is that
Yeah.
that insecurity that drives
that
a lot
maybe
of what
drives
we
you
do.
on. Or,
And I find, you know, we were talking off camera earlier about, you know, women who have been significant, and say Yvonne Boland has been
Yes,
significant in
yes.
your writing life. And
yes.
now what was I going to say
And
about
Paula.
that? Oh yes,
Paula
and I
Meehan.
find, and Paula Meehan, and but
Katie
but
Donovan.
and there was a group. Yeah, there was a group of us more or less in the same age group. Well, you know, I know Yvonne is older, but you know, who probably aided and abetted one another. But I don't see myself as a feminist poet, although my first collection is very strongly informed by feminism, and I would regard myself as a feminist.
As a feminist, yeah.
But I was
Not a
listening to
feminist poet,
a
yeah.
programme last night, the Brendan O'Connor conversation. I don't know what
yeah.
it's called.
Something on the edge or something?
Yes,
isn't it?
on
Yeah.
Cutting Edge,
Cutting
I think.
Edge.
And there was a woman on that whose name I forget. She had a minute to speak, and she was
Okay.
a woman in her middle years who feels today's feminism has no space for her feminism.
Yes,
And
yeah.
I'm quite perturbed sometimes too. I feel I identified with what she was saying, and like I found it very odd to be invited last Christmas to a party in the liquor rooms by the feminazis.
All right.
I
I
find
was
that
in the liquor rooms last night at
the
the
feminazis,
course.
feminism and
Yeah.
Nazism.
Yes,
I
yeah.
know it's meant to be ironic and
Yeah.
funny.
Yeah, yeah.
Actually, I don't find that funny.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it's the very worst thing that you could ever add to feminists.
Yeah.
Yes, well,
You know,
true,
Absolutely.
yes.
And
Yeah.
So awareness of
and
language.
so there's
and
a
its
you know, but
nuances.
Yeah.
so there's a different sense. There's something different going on that I wouldn't necessarily recognise. And okay, it is after all an ideology. And the best we can do is apply it in a practical sense in our lives, you know, as
Well, I was
good,
going to
fair
say,
women.
I
if
know
we can.
Mary and I have daughters of a similar age, and I don't know about your daughter, but my daughter totally tells me, I probably get the numbers wrong, I'm second wave feminist,
Yes.
and they're third wave, and that I have nothing to say to them, and all I just say is, keep your eye on it, girls, keep your eye very, very firmly on it, and let's just see, you're very lucky to be white in the Western world, in a
Yeah.
particular, well, you mightn't feel you are with Trump and what's happening in England, but you know what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
As I said, not too far up the road, they are still cutting women's genitals, doing all sorts of dreadful, dreadful things. Never take your eye off that one, whatever wave you're calling
Yeah.
it.
And you know,
Yeah.
actually, my daughter said something
Did
similar
she?
to me
Did she?
recently because I had said something which was, I don't know what it was. She felt I was losing my feminist credentials, and she said, "Mommy, is this the woman who explained to me about first, second, and third wave feminism? I just don't believe it." So something must have got through, you know.
Yeah.
Yes,
I
yeah.
think
I'm pleased about that.
Yeah.
actually.
Every generation thinks that they know a lot more than the
Yes,
previous generation
yeah.
until they get to a certain age when they realise just how much.
Absolutely. Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
I care very deeply about feminism, and last
You
night
do?
that woman on the cutting edge, she felt that feminism, that we should be as concerned about female genital mutilation
Absolutely.
and say female illiteracy, which of course is vastly more than male illiteracy when people are
Yeah.
very poor.
Yeah.
But she felt, or there was a woman on that panel who's half Nigerian, and she felt the Irish woman was being condescending by taking on those
Oh,
subjects,
okay.
as if
Okay.
her whiteness was saying,
Yes,
well, we
was-
can help you, dears.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But in fact, I didn't
Okay.
think that was what she intended. I think it's up to us to be aware of
Of
everything.
everything.
It is extraordinary how people
So you
assume
can't
that
win.
you have to be.
I've written, which I hope is a delicate poem on the idea of female genital mutilation, and maybe it's not a good enough poem, but I certainly haven't had anyone offering to publish it for me. That I have noticed.
Yeah.
Now, maybe the poem isn't up to scratch, but
I have one
There
in my
may be-
first
No,
collection
yeah.
of poetry as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
Because, anyway, I suppose.
Well, if you have that poem here,
No, I
No?
don't have it
Well,
here. No,
what,
no.
what did you bring?
I brought one that is not in any of my collections. It's just published recently in Poetry Ireland. Am I allowed to give free ads for Poetry Ireland?
Absolutely.
It was in Vona Groark's last issue,
Okay.
and it was a poem about my mother and a misunderstanding and how things can happen where, as I say, she suffered with mental illness, but how a misunderstanding can happen. And I let the poem talk for itself,
Okay.
and hope it does. And it's called Suppose. Suppose that the hammer's trajectory had been a fraction more to the left, the wind direction easterly instead of west, or that he had turned his head instinctively on hearing something whoosh through the air, it would have been a different story. Suppose when I went into Mother's room, excited to show my latest trawl of tadpoles, swimming their endless question marks in the mason jar, she had turned instead and dashed them to the floor where they floundered, open-mouthed and drowning in air, rather than distractedly pushing me out towards the door with a murmur of nice, nice. Suppose I had not turned at the last moment to see her raise her hand, armed with a claw hammer, and heft it through the already cracked glass of pane with a shout, "Now you'll fix it, you bastard." I did, though, and everything splintered, and through the gaping maw of the frame I saw my baby brother sit quietly in the garden, a red blanket under him, glass shards glittering all around like Chinese luck money, and just beyond in the long grass, the hammer with its head and cleft, buried and rendered harmless. Suppose my father and aunt had seen it from my vantage point, and not what they thought they saw, my troubled mother fling a hammer at my brother's head. Had I not froze, been too shocked to talk, I could have told them. The doctor came and they gentled her out into the waiting car. She returned weeks later, eyes shattered, her speech hammered fragments.
Wow. Very, very
That is a
powerful.
fantastic poem.
Yeah.
Funnily enough, I was thinking about it this morning. I was wondering, would you read it? And obviously,
Yeah.
I was.
That suppose, that sort of
Yeah.
repeated suppose, which
It
I,
is
I
based
guess-
on a completely true.
yeah, the suppose probably drives a lot of our writing in the end.
Yeah.
Mary, did you bring something?
I did. Yeah. I'll. What'll I say? I think I'll read the opening poem from this collection,
Which
Those
is the
April
most recent-
Fevers. This is the most recent one. It was published in
Fabulous poem,
2015.
Yeah, lovely.
And originally the book was to be called Baltic Amber, and then in the end the editor suggested that I might just take the phrase Those April Fevers instead.
Mhm.
So I agreed. Anyway, and it's really a poem in which I think I'm considering time passing and age. Someone said I would uncover pieces of amber from long dead trees on this Baltic shoreline. Day by day, I leave the cottage, walk the sands to a headland village. Nobody understands what I mean when I mention amber, their minds engrossed by hazel branches hung with painted eggs, catkins, or hyacinths in bowls. The time for hyacinths is long gone, I tell them. I am in need of something that has survived more than winter, hardening to translucent gold, enclosing, perhaps, one small seed to honour the month and the Easter I was conceived. I have grown 6 decades like aeons, and my tears have surely become like amber, enriched and smooth, taking tawny colours for blood. Next week, I will be casual about the search, will uncover nuggets beneath tree fragments, inhaling salt and resin as I turn freely from eggs, catkins, those April fevers.
Bravo.
Fabulous.
Thank you.
So visual.
I've had to tell Mary I robbed her those April fevers. I just so loved it.
Well, that's
I-
the-
Did you? You took the phrase.
I
did
took
you?
the phrase. I
It's
did
the
admit
ultimate.
that to her.
Yeah,
I
it was a
took the
great
phrase.
compliment. Actually.
And I'm sure you
Fabulous.
italicised it.
I don't know if I did or
Oh,
not, but I
well.
will if I haven't.
No, you
Brilliant.
should. Yeah.
So we're coming to a sort of a close here. I'm just wondering what advice either of you might have to a writer, to a poet in particular, at the start or beginning their journey.
Read, 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 read. Write, 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 write. Revise, revise, revise. That'd be nearly it. But
Yeah.
Yeah.
Be honest, though everything in life seems to
Yeah.
suggest
Yes.
that one should be otherwise
Yeah.
as if you want to be a career poet.
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
But I think be honest and don't suck up and read a lot and write a lot. Because the more you read, the better you will write.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And just
absolutely.
attend the best readings and enjoy one another. That's what I think, instead of always competing.
That's a great piece of advice. Hard to follow through, I think, sometimes.
Yeah.
That sort of anxiety of
Feeling that there's only a small cake and we're all
Yes.
nibbling it. Yeah.
long
Well,
leaves,
Mary's-
hyenas,
and there
and stale
is.
bread.
Mary's very generous with
It-
the cake.
It
Yeah.
is a small cake in a
Yeah.
sense, isn't it?
Yeah.
But, you know, like in 100 years' time, nobody's going to care about any of us having
No.
written.
No.
Nobody is
No,
going to care about
no.
most of us. I mean, there'll be the odd one.
Mm.
But, you know, so that's why I think it's really important to just be in the here and now. And it's not, I'm not into mindfulness and all that, but the here
Yeah.
and now of your work
Yeah. Yeah.
and paying attention.
Yeah.
Attention.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, well that
Yeah.
that is great advice on which to end this. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you,
coming
Nessa.
to the attic and
Thank you for having us.
chatting
Yeah.
to us. Really looking forward to the next work when it appears. And thank you very much for watching us. We'll be back next month with goodness knows what. But please do join us and spread the word.
Yes, I know that I'm just a dreamer. I dream 'cause it's the closest I'll ever get to you.